Preface. The author of this story will always write as if Fred Weasley lived through the Battle of Hogwarts. Long live all the Weasleys. My goodness, it's been quite the eventful week, I don't mind telling you. On Tuesday, we had heard on the Wizard Wireless Network that as a result of the lunar eclipse, a group of werewolves were making their way through the countryside, hunting anything they could. The pull of a lunar eclipse makes them more crazed, and sometimes they revert to even more of their wolf-like instincts. This means they pack hunt, rather than their full moon transformation rotation being undertaken solo. Arthur had heard that a Ministry of Magic task force had been put together, but had not yet managed to capture the murderous pack. In Witch Weekly, an article about how to protect yourself and loved ones was written sporting the title 5 Ways to Distract a Werewolf from Attack. I had skimmed the article one afternoon whilst having a cup of tea. Well, I didn't take much notice of it at all. It's one thing or another always, and the Ministry did seem to be on top of it. It wasn't until Thursday that things became dire. Arthur had been told by Sturgis Podmore that a small group of werewolves were in this part of the country. Well, Arthur then contacted the children at once. George, Fred and Charlie still live in this part of the country. Of course, Fred and Charlie live together, as it's easier for them to coordinate their joint dragon excursions. The newly married George and Angelina are just 2 hills over. Percy was at the Burrow at the time. Percy still spends rather a lot of time at the Burrow with Arthur, even though he has a flat in London. Bill, Ron and Ginny were fine, nowhere near the trouble. George and Angelina were the first to apparate in. Fred and Charlie followed shortly after via the flu network. Arthur reassured them that it was just a good precaution to be together. As some of the members of the crazed group of werewolves had evaded the Ministry task force, I was just excited to have an excuse to have some of the brood together. Well, as we sat having some roast lamb dinner, a Patronus in the shape of a rabbit bounded in through the stained glass kitchen window and right across the middle of our table and boomed the voice of Luna Scamander.
Family in cellar, the werewolf pack ran over us. They are 1 mile away from you. Take cover.
Arthur pushed his chair away from the table and, somewhat panicked, now ordered us to go up. We all started running up the stairs as Bill yelled behind me, "To Ron's room! It's the highest point!" The 7 of us ran up as far as we could, with me following right behind Angelina, Fred and Percy, who were in front of me. We all got to Ron's room and stood in the middle. Charlie and Arthur opened the door to the small balcony that sat adjoined to Ron's room, and over their shoulders, that's when I first saw them. Their snarling snouts and saliva-soaked fangs, 4 of them. Werewolves. Confusion and fear gripped my heart all at once. What were they doing here? Could they smell us so high up? The answer came immediately. The chicken coop. After the children had arrived, Arthur had cast the protective charms Protego Maxima and Fianto Jury, which when combined is a very strong protective shield. But the werewolves were repeatedly throwing themselves against the invisible barrier closest to the protective shield. One werewolf was standing on its hind leg, its front paws pressed up against the invisible barrier. As I edged closer to the balcony where Charlie and Arthur stood, I could hear George reassure everyone behind me that the protection would hold. As he did, one werewolf bounded towards the barrier and was thrown back a few meters. George looked like he was right, but then it happened. 2 of the wolves looked up, finally realizing we were looking down upon them. Although we were a good 3 stories above them, I could clearly see the bloodshot red of their huge eyes glaring with sheer desperation at us all. Within a moment, all 4 of the wolves now seemed to glean our presence. One werewolf paced back and forth, its huge claws scraping the earth beneath it. Percy called us all back from the balcony, saying we needed to stay out of sight. Minutes passed, us all sitting around nervously, the blood-curdling snarls and grunts emanating from below us. It wasn't passing. They weren't moving away. As I looked around at my family in this small room, I could see the fear present across them all, in their expressions and tightened limbs. But we were safe. They could not reach us. More time passed. I looked at Fred, who announced after glancing at his wristwatch that it had been 20 minutes already. Charlie then slowly stood up, saying that we need to see what's going on out there. Charlie then softly uttered, "Insensilis." I could see the light veil of the disillusionment charm fall over the edges of the balcony awning down to past the balcony floorboards. All 7 of us slowly walked outside, Bill leaning on the wooden balcony rail. The sight was terrifying. The disillusionment charm had not appeared to deter the wolves. They were not tricked. All 4 of the beasts continued to look up, the brutal, almost human-like understanding etched in their murderous eyes. They knew we were still there. Percy whispered out that we needed to get rid of the chickens. He held his wand over the wooden balcony rail and muttered, "Veriverto." The hens had long taken cover in their hut, given the racket that the werewolves had been making in the last hour, but with a faint pop, it could have been assumed that the hens had all been transfigured in unison. Percy looked over and said, "Pebbles." Now that the hens had been changed into pebbles, perhaps their smell would stop drawing in the werewolves. But over the next few minutes, even with us behind the disillusionment charm, all the wolves continued to remain at the invisible barrier. 2 werewolves pacing, 1 sitting, and 1 standing. Stay tuned to see how the Weasleys contend with the crazed werewolves. How will this story end? Part 2 to be released shortly.